Hey, Mars here. Today I'm here to talk about fascism, mainly because it's more prevalent than ever, and that is due to America being super divided and a lot of bigotry just strewn about, and more people defaulting to just blatant conspiracy. In response, some have taken to arming up in defense of themselves, while others have taken to organizing against them, or sometimes both. Some groups and ideologies are a real threat to our society and its integrity, but today we're only going to be really talking about one ideology in particular, and that is American fascism. And just as a message, if any of the people that I know in real life that are right leaning are watching this video right now, watch to the end.
Watch to the end.
Fascism, especially in America, is a topic that a lot of people talk about and point out in specific instances, but I'm here to grab all of it and just put it all together into one coherent package. To start with, I'm going to be going through Umberto Eco's 14 points, otherwise known as fascism, and I'm going to give examples for every single point and see how it expresses either straight up fascism or fascistic tendencies or characteristics, or either one. I will then use that evidence that I collected for fascism and use it and try to see how it correlates with another model, though not nearly as in depth, but I will still compare it to a different model. I will then relate those findings to just some simple definitions and then see where we round up after that. I'm also only going to be using evidence that's really easy to find. And there are two reasons for that. Reason number one, I want to explain and express how easy fascism is to detect within modern day life and how just blatant it is in society. And for reason number two, time reasons, I don't want to spend 4+ hours on each individual point. That would be ridiculous. It would take me months and the video would be like 16 hours long. So, no. But yeah, that's those are the reasons I'm only going to be using evidence that's super easy to find. Starting off with some background lore, Umberto Eco was an Italian historian who lived through the age of Italian fascism under Mussolini. His literature on the subject grabs from mostly personal experience. He wasn't just a bystander either. He was deep in the trenches of fascism. He was part of the young fascist group of the time. From his essay, Fascism, he describes 14 common characteristics among fascist nations. I will apply this model to attitudes, behaviors, and sometimes even legislation that occurs within the United States. I'll mostly be attacking the right, so any conservacuck snowflakes can concede that they're cowards and leave now if they wish. As a final note, before I start the video in earnest, it's important to keep in mind that according to Umberto Eco, fascism only needs a single point to be true in order to coagulate and take hold in some way. Remember that. Point numero uno, the cult of tradition. One has only looked to the syllabus of every fascist movement to find the major traditionalist thinkers. The Nazi Gnosis was nourished by traditionalist, syncretistic, occult elements. In terms of political ideology in relation to the global Overton window, America seems to be generally right-leaning, averse to progress, and a pretty traditional country. The United States has a habit of getting to economic and social progress a bit late, and a large portion of the country's voter base favors tradition over progress. Even traditional extremism seems to take form within our union. The most blatant example of this is the common layman arguments against queer people, and those arguments being of natural law and normalcy. It is not uncommon to see homophobic people utilizing the status quo to their advantage, picking apart gay people simply because they just aren't normal. It is also common to see them using the idea of nature in order to deconstruct them, claiming that being gay is not natural despite overwhelming opposing evidence. Not only are both of these arguments simply wrong, but they're also fallacious, yet they are so common amongst the right. They will also mystify the concept of the traditional family unit and weaponize that against them as the basis of their disagreement. It is not rare to see them using the traditional family unit to say that gay people should not be parents, since, as according to the nuclear family, the parents should be of opposite sex. They will claim it breaks the traditional family unit and is therefore unrespectable. They also hold tradition as the utmost familial goodness. But is there syncretism? A large characteristic of Nazi-esque fascism was their religious syncretism. Well, we don't really see religion take hold very much in terms of mythology unless you really count Mormonism or the American Bible. But we do see syncretism in the sense of contradicting moral, political, and religious beliefs all being held at the same time. We see Christians and Catholics praise the Word of God, yet pledge ultimate allegiance to one's country, even going so far as to say that they should be intertwined. They fly flags of the state, they will huff and puff about people not standing for the Pledge of Allegiance, yet they preach that God is the only truth. In some cases, we even see teachers forcing their students to do patriotic work, and as of 2019 through 2021, most states were requiring their students to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, though, in fairness, there were easily accessible exemptions. Even before this traditional act of national worship was legally mandated, social shunning or disrespect was commonplace towards people who didn't at least stand for the pledge. I have even experienced it myself. This is clear foreshadowing towards a broader movement of ultranationalism, but we can get to that later. We see people preaching about biblical fundamentalism or biblical values, but then some refuse to house the homeless because of their equal love for the capitalist economy and their God. They would rather offload the real work onto charities instead of either doing it themselves or getting the government to actually fix a single real problem. It's worth noting how gun culture and hyper-glorification of the military are also extremely large parts of American society, despite the Bible teaching against war and even killing in all circumstances. Tools of death are assimilated as equal parts of our culture as the Bible is. This is clear syncretism right here. As for in terms of a more popular political sense, the most popular right-wing pundits are traditional extremists in many cases. Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles, Andrew Tate, Sneeko, Jordan Peterson, and Steven Crowder. They hold tradition and traditional values as the utmost and ultimate political good. They disavow gay marriage and gender nonconformity. They disavow the right to choose in terms of pregnancy. They disavow transgenderism, whatever that even is, all because of tradition and traditional values, not to mention religious morality. We're even seeing this on a legal basis. Roe v. Wade has already been overturned, and Clarence Thomas, who is one of the people who spearheaded this, has spoken on how he would like to review other rights the same way they reviewed Roe. These rights even include contraception, but mainly same-sex marriage. We're seeing no-fault divorce laws being questioned again in the wake of the Steven Crowder divorce drama. It all harkens back to a cult-like love and belief in tradition and traditional values as opposed and sometimes in direct spite of social progress. It's also seen in extreme while still very mainstream messaging. Make America Great Again was Trump's slogan, which is a national dog whistle. And again, we'll get to nationalism later. But in terms of this point, it appeals to that yearning for a return to a past time of greatness. And if it's still not clear from these examples that are admittedly pretty easy to find, we even have entire social media accounts with millions of followers dedicated to shitting on progressivism in the name of traditional values. It should be clear that the majority of the right, at the very least, holds cult-like mentalities towards tradition, even sometimes despite contradicting values being adopted. A staunch disagreement with social change and a propagation of the status quo is the main point of their entire platform. But it's not just that creates the cult-like mentality, it's also them ostracizing their children for not being perfectly straight, it's them trying to keep opposing information out of schools, it's them pushing for conversion therapy because they think the advent of traditional values will save them, etc. It's holding these values as the epitome of societal good and opposing all that doesn't correlate with these values in an arrogantly stubborn manner. Point 2. The rejection of modernism. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, fascism can be defined as irrationalism. This point is a little weird to determine because back in the time of old fascism, during Italy, Germany, and things like that, modernism was a much bigger topic, but with the advent of neo-fascism, the goal and kind of scapegoat has shifted over to postmodernism and its stand-in, cultural Marxism. If we want to go word for word and blow for blow, then all I really have to say for this point is that some conservatives just don't like modernism and others don't even know what it is. So that's that. But if we take in modernism's modern equivalent, then we can determine this point using postmodernism and whatever the fuck they think cultural Marxism is on any given Tuesday. Postmodernism asserts that grand theories and objective truths are either not real or unknowable for humans. Conservative intellectuals and pseudo-intellectuals alike view this rejection as a movement towards societal depravity. This is because with the rejection of grand theories comes the rejection of God. With the rejection of God comes the advent of hedonistic degeneracy. These are very similar reasons for why the rejection of modernism was very common during the fascist regime of Italy. Religious apologists often strawman postmodernism as if it claims any autonomous individuals view themselves as gods simply because of the rejection of the Abrahamic deity they simp for. We also see this trend following a conspiracy theory called cultural Marxism. It's the boogeyman that modernism once was, even more so than postmodernism. More people are coming out as transgender? It's the fault of cultural Marxism. More people are divorcing their abusive husbands? Cultural Marxism. Gay people have a more public presence? Cultural Marxism. Feminism, sexual and racial diversity in TV shows? Cultural Marxism. I mean, overall, it just seems like there's a trend of attacking both postmodernism and cultural Marxism and blaming them as the root causes of the downfall of Western society. Even if the rejection of modernism is no longer relevant, the reasons they abhor cultural Marxism and postmodernism are very similar. A clear line can be drawn between two different sets of rejections. But if you're a kind of like blow for blow kind of guy and you only really want to care about like blow for blow, word for word, then feel free to just discard this entire point. Just know that a bunch of concepts fit the bill for how modernism was rejected and the reasons for why it was rejected in fascist regimes. Point number 3. The cult of action for action's sake. Action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation, aka anti-intellectualism. The first clothing change of the video. Clothing and slight environment. Get used to it because I am recording these on different days. There are many examples of radical action based on anti-intellectual principles, but here I'll just give the largest and most recent examples. One such example is the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Common behaviors we saw was a mass hysteria that's even still seen to this day about vaccines and masks. Irrational skepticism based on alternative facts given by fourth-rate sources and a willingness to believe in literal lies in the face of scientific consensus. Which is also seen for trans people. 3 examples of this being anti-mask protests. When masks were being mandated, anti-mask protests cropped up, even some of them being violent. All over irrational anger and fear that the government was systemically taking away our constitutional rights, despite mask mandates not being a new thing and is usually done during deadly pandemics such as this one. Alternative medicine sources. Pushing and promoting alternative medicine sources that had and still don't have consistent medical proof that they work on people, as opposed to tried and true methods and a vaccine that at the time was very effective and showed no signs of adverse side effects. And their alternative medicines were much more harmful than the vaccine was, and COVID-19 was also much more harmful than either of them. Fake vaccine seizure videos. Studies and medical analysis have shown that vaccine side effects as of 2023 only amount to mostly mild and most importantly short-term adverse side effects. However, there are many videos of people having seizures with the caption denoting that it was due to the vaccine, though all of them have been made by conservatives. Funny how that works. It's worth noting that the overall anti-vax for all or most vaccines is being spearheaded by the right. There is a very small amount of anti-vax people on the left. Overall, COVID-19 alone is proof enough of the rampant anti-intellectualism in the United States, but one topic in particular has been around longer and is a lot more prevalent. And that topic is the belief that climate change is a hoax. Around 15% of Americans do not believe in climate change in spite of overwhelming bodies of evidence, and around 30% believe that it's not caused by humans despite, again, overwhelming bodies of evidence. You want to guess which political party has most of these people? It's perfectly fine to have a disagreement about a couple of specifics, but flat out disbelieving already overwhelming and still growing bodies of evidence and global scientific consensus is tantamount to still believing that the Earth is flat, which is also a right-leaning conspiracy theory. 30% of people, that's over a quarter of Americans, believe it's not caused by humans, despite study after study, literature review after literature review, and global consensus on the issue. After all of that, they still disbelieve it to be the case. And that's the lesser of the two. 15% still believe climate change isn't even real. That's around 50 million Americans who simply don't believe in climate change. This is partly due to the mass amounts of propaganda against it done by climate deniers and Fox News hosts paid for by oil companies. But this still plays into that rampant anti-intellectualism that plagues this country. It's not just the people either. Officials and lawmakers have even taken to using the tactics of non-decision making specifically against climate change, and others have even stooped so low as to falsify government reports. And those are just the largest two examples. There are many, many, many more examples, like CRT being banned in school despite literally being an academic study, and a lot of book bans, which is bad on its own, but as of 2023, primarily target LGBTQ books, which also plays into cult of tradition, being so traditional as a society that you go and ban books to keep your society homogenous. We also have the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, which was promised to only target K through 4, but now we're seeing it target K through 12. We're also seeing a new movement against sex ed, despite it being proven to reduce rates of sexual violence and has not been a political issue until recently. Now, all of a sudden, people think it's grooming despite 2 months earlier not having an opinion on the topic. They don't actually care about safety. They only care about controlling the distribution of knowledge and information, and a lot of right-leaning voters are here supporting it all the way. Even if they don't support it themselves, they're still supporting it, or at least being okay with it by voting these people in. When they can't directly control that information, they will discount the validity of certain areas of academic study. For example, we see heavy propaganda against the so-called liberal arts, calling it leftist indoctrination and the source of modern cultural Marxism, despite liberal arts literally meaning anything from basic literature studies to math and science. And yet, they'll ignorantly claim that the left hates science, yet they will denounce the academic model that contains the majority of scientific study. We also see right-wingers being anti-intellectual in interpersonal examples. Having a debate with a right-winger is like having a debate with someone who doesn't even think they can be wrong. And as a personal anecdote, every single time I've had a genuine debate with a right-winger, they either resort to gish-galloping, straw-manning, pivoting the conversation, moving the goalpost, just completely utilizing non-sequiturs, or just running away entirely. There are also a lot of people who will just flat out reject studies, literature reviews, meta-analyses, all as a proper mode of distributing information.
This is a meta-study of a whole bunch of studies. I have another meta-study.
So wait, but hold on.
But I'm trying to pull up a scientific study to confirm what you're saying.
Yeah, I also just want to ask a question about this too.
Sure.
So you're mentioning that this is a meta-analysis of studies
Yes.
on people who have detransitioned, but by definition, right, this is taking into account people who went through, puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapy, physical surgeries?
Sure, for each study it was different things. In some of the studies, it was people who were going through puberty blockers, some had hormone therapy, but a lot of them in one form or another had received gender-affirming care. They were trans when the study first tried to identify these people, and then it looked at them years later.
And how is this sample collected? Because almost every single issue or almost every single study I've seen from trans advocates on this issue use a convenience sample rather than doing some kind of controlled randomized test for the treatment.
So this is a meta-study of a whole bunch of other studies. So you would have to go between each study, because at the end of the day, I don't want to fall in this trap that me and Tim were about to do, where each of us starts saying like, well, I have a study, well, you have a study, well, I have a study. We could do this all day. So we should look at metadata, right? We should look at compromising data that looks over a whole bunch of studies. A second metadata study that I want you to look at, Regret After Gender-Affirming Surgery, a systematic review and meta-analysis of prevalence. This went to Canada, the Netherlands, Belgium, UK, Italy, USA, Brazil, Sweden, Singapore, Germany, Norway, Ireland, Serbia, and an interview between 27 studies, 7,928 trans patients. It showed a less than 1% regret rate.
So
also, can I also mention something? Desistance and detransition.
I have another meta study.
Okay, I got to address this right now. There is a problem we are facing in that you are saying a lot of things, and I can't pull up any sources. At the very least, all I did was Google searched it. I pulled up the 2 studies that were associated with it and said, here's what it says. I have not given you my personal perspective on it. You've now given me your personal view on it.
No, I've given you the studies. These are 2 meta studies. I have a third meta study.
What are the studies? Let me please pull them up. I can't find what you're talking about.
The first one is Cornell University. They did a meta study.
What's the name of it?
It's Cornell University's meta study of 72 studies on gender-affirming care. Of that, 55 of the studies were directly related to detransitioning.
What meta study on?
I just want to flag that desistance and detransitioning are 2 different things.
Right.
Well.
Look up
Cornell University.
Cornell University. What does scholarly research say about the effect of gender transition or on gender trans well-being?
Oh, here we go. I found it.
Nice. And the third meta study that I want to bring up is a U.S. study. It's a 2015 U.S. transgender study.
But this isn't a scientific research paper that's peer reviewed.
No, this is a meta-analysis of scientifically researched papers.
Did you get that from what we know? Inequality.
But hold on, like, do we have a standard on why should we accept?
If you want to know their methodology, there's a click here to view the methodology thing. You can find that out for yourself right there.
But this is not a peer-reviewed scientific paper.
This is a meta-analysis, Tim.
Okay,
of peer-reviewed scientific papers.
I reject it outright.
Okay.
Sometimes, with more pernicious examples, even taking the citation or usage of studies as an admission of loss and a lack of common sense. It doesn't really quite get any more anti-intellectual than that. In terms of action for action's sake specifically, we see a few examples. I mean, there's the NoFap November challenge, for example. It's for some, it's a fun challenge, but for others, it's a testament to their willpower and masculinity, despite not really being evidence of either. We're also seeing the rise of neo-fascist urban warfare groups like the Proud Boys and Patriot Front who routinely train for war. And I ain't talking about no foreign relations kind of war. I'm talking about a civil war. They're training for urban warfare and civil wars. We also see this in our politicians. For example, Donald Trump is largely thought to be a man of action rather than words, a man who gets done what needs to be done instead of sitting and talking. This is also just the tip of the anti-intellectual iceberg, but it's clear just from these few examples that this point has its conditions met by many, many Americans.
This is a meta-analysis, Tim.
I
peer-reviewed scientific papers.
I reject it outright.
Point number 4. Disagreement is treason. The critical spirit makes distinctions, and to distinguish is a sign of modernism. In modern culture, the scientific community praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. There's not many public or legal examples of this point, but sometimes we get a rare gem and see it pop up legally, but sometimes, and more commonly, see it pop up interpersonally. Having a differing opinion gets you otherized by more traditionally minded groups of people. If you're a male feminist, you're not a real man. If you're dating interracially, you're a race traitor, though to be fair, that isn't very common, or at least that specific sentiment, but being in cahoots with people that do share that sentiment is more common. If you're a Democrat, you're an enemy of freedom. If you're part of the press, you're an enemy of the people. And if you're anti-capitalism, well, then you're just a good-for-nothing communist. If you support welfare programs, you just are a lazy-ass socialist and you want free stuff. If you question God, you're nothing but a nihilist and a degenerate. And if you question traditional values as a whole, that just makes you a hedonist. And God forbid, you're a conservative yourself and you start to question God. Because then you're a Democrat. And Democrats are evil and they're groomers and they're child molesters and they're all this crazy stuff. You don't want to be a Democrat, do you? But it's not just socially that we see these things. We also see it legally sometimes, though it is rare. We saw 2 Tennessee lawmakers get temporarily booted because they dared to speak against the majority Republican legislative body in that state. We saw the same thing happen to Montana House member Zoe Zephyr simply because she called out the anti-trans bills being potentially passed in that state. They then booted her, forcing her to work on the benches outside for a number of days. Like I said, this point doesn't always rear its ugly head, but when it does, it's quite something to behold.
This is a meta-analysis, Tim.
I
peer-reviewed scientific papers.
I reject it outright.
Point number 5. Fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders. Thus, fascism is racist by definition. This is likely the most self-evident point out of the whole bunch. Even just from stuff that I've listed earlier, this point should be already proven, but we'll add more to it, okay? We're always going to add more to it. Recently, the right has taken to their shtick of ostracizing minorities to a more extreme and a lot more of an explicit extreme at that. LGBTQ book bans, membership increases of neo-fascist and supremacist groups, some white supremacist, some black supremacist, but neo-fascist and very right-wing nonetheless. Most unfortunate of all, a lot of further right Republicans and even mainstream Republicans and a lot of pundits have found their modern-day equivalent to the Nazis' Jew, transgender people. The recent rhetoric towards them has been of literal genocide and extermination.
Any parents that would have their child have a transgender surgery done on them, any parent that would do that, they just need to be shot in the back of the head. They need to be convicted in trial and immediately shot in the back of the head. Okay? And then we can string them up above a bridge. And so that the public can see the consequences of that kind of wickedness. And so there should be no excuse to not put these people to death. No excuse whatsoever. And go ahead and turn to Ephesians chapter number 4. And let me tell you, there are very, very few people out there in the world today that are actually fighting the spiritual fight. I want you to go ahead and find me another preacher in Spokane that preached a message where they said that these child molesters, that these child butchers, that these all the LGBTQ people that desire strange flesh, that they should all be put to death in a public execution by the government. Find me the preacher that says that. I want to see him.
In order for women to have the right to have their own bathrooms, you have to ban transgenderism entirely. You can't just ban it for the kids. It's got to be entirely. In order for women to be able to have their own locker rooms at the gym, you have to ban transgenderism entirely. In order to protect businesses from having to participate in weird occult sexual rituals like the transgender transition, you have to ban transgenderism entirely. I love this bill because it is so much more aggressive than the other bills we've seen. I don't mean to knock the other governors and the other state houses. They've done a great job laying the groundwork, but this bill goes much further, and it reminds us of a truth in politics that Republicans all too often forget. You're either on offense or you're on defense. You're either making gains in the culture or you're losing ground in the culture. There's no standing still. There's no status quo. There's no neutrality. And what the conservatives have screwed up on for at least 50 years now, probably more, is the libs make some crazy aggressive play, and then we try to dial it back by about 5 to 10%. Or worse, we try to slow it down by about 5 to 10%. So the libs attack the family through feminism, the fundamental political institution. They claim that men and women are basically the same. That takes the culture pretty far to the left, and then conservatives try to inch it back a little bit, but not by the time they're even thinking about inching it back, the libs push forward with the normalization of other sexual practices, gay rights, among other things. And then, by the time the conservatives are trying to dial that back, the libs, they've lurched much further to the left. They're trying to redefine marriage now. They say, redefine marriage? Well, I don't know. I guess we could come to some kind of terms with a civil union, and by the time you say that, they've lurched even further to the left. Now they're saying, actually, we've got transgenderism. Actually, now a man can become a woman. A man can become a woman, okay, but maybe we shouldn't do it to by the time we say that, oh my gosh, we're all the way off the screen. Because now they're trying to trans the kids. And there are many conservatives now who are saying, look, if you're a man and you want to put on a dress, that's fine, but just don't do it to children. Just don't make me pay for it. No.
They propagandize against trans people as grooming your kids and acting as if they're all pedophiles. It's not hard to see that the point of this rhetoric is to get you to hate trans people. It's designed to encourage domestic terrorism and has already contributed to it. And the propaganda against drag does much of the same thing. Anything against the status quo and what is considered normal is at its baseline weird. But with trans people in drag, it's always the most extreme. Lawmakers are banning public drag performances, they're outlawing access to gender-affirming care, in some cases even for adults, forcing them to detransition. All while going onto national television or onto the largest social media platform in the world and constantly yelling, "These people are coming for your kids." It's almost self-evident how this point should be universally recognized as true by every single living person in the United States, even if you agree with the rhetoric being used. Half of the examples and evidence for other points also contribute to this point. They view transgender women as males invading female spaces, including lesbian spaces and bathrooms. Even the token doctors of the Conservative Party view trans women as an invasion of female spaces and female rights.
For Christ's sake, Males in Disguise is a literal Twitter account with over 60,000 followers. Oh my god.
Even libs of TikTok constantly fearmongers about queer people with thousands upon thousands of likes, and that account has over 2 million followers. And Wokeness is an account dedicated to shitting on people different from the norm with over 1 million followers as well. We even have the new Matt Walsh movie, What is a Woman, just now releasing, which ended up being just a crack pile barrel of just constant anti-trans propaganda, especially in the third act.
We literally have calls for actual denotative genocide in mainstream Republican circles. Though, in the name of fairness, I should note that a lot of moderates, and probably all of them actually, don't subscribe to this recent rhetoric about trans people and wanting to kill all of them. Most, if not all, moderates are against that, including the right-leaning ones. And I'd wager, personally, that a good majority of right-wing voters also aren't on board. But they do vote in people who are, and they also support people who are. If anything is the root of fascism in this country, it's the massive fear of difference and the rampant bigotry that blights this country. And the LGBTQ examples are just the tip of the iceberg. I haven't even gone over race or class relations in this country, and I think we all know that those have at least some bearing in this conversation.
You have to ban transgenderism entirely. You can't just ban it for the kids. It's got to be entirely.
Point number 6. Appeal to social frustration. One of the most typical features of historical fascism was the appeal to a frustrated middle class, a class suffering from economic crisis or feeling of political humiliation, and frightened by the pressure of lower social groups.
This appeal to a frustrated middle class can actually be found in politics quite often. It was especially prevalent during the 2016 election and the Trump presidency, but it can still be seen now.
Trump was believed to be a man of the working class, a man who gets it and gets shit done for his people. This rhetoric was used to propel what was back then, and even now, a massive anti-immigration movement, which also feeds into fear of difference and the cult of tradition, on the grounds of immigration being a massive negative event for the working class. A movement which contains rhetoric such as, "They're taking American jobs," or "They're receiving aid, but not you," even though they know full well they won't ever actually give you anything even if the immigrants weren't here. They appeal to the high taxes and scream about Ukraine and the funding we're giving them, even when they know damn well our taxes would still be just as high even if we weren't funding them, because they always find a way to raise them anyways. At the bottom of it all, they utilize ultranationalist rhetoric to gain the favor of the working class. Make America Great Again and the America First movement are two such movements that utilize ultranationalist fervor. They make use of the regressionist nationalist idea of a return to, and hearkening back to, a vague time of greatness in American exceptionalism when we put our people first, despite us never doing that in the first place. Make America Great Again is literally a parrot of Adolf Hitler's slogan when he was vying for power in Germany. One of his slogans was literally, "Make Germany Great Again." It doesn't get much more on the nose than that. Not to mention, they brand themselves as part of the working class, sometimes while demonizing Democrats as enemies of the people. They even use the America First rhetoric to get people on board with the idea of constructing a Christian nation where Christian values are legally enforceable. I mean, for Christ's sake, trickle-down economics was literally a movement that was designed to appeal to the middle and lower classes so rich people could get richer. Accusing transgender people and cultural Marxism as being the root of the downfall of Western society is in some way an appeal to this nationalistic attitude. It's not just that they try to grab votes from a middle class that is deeply frustrated, it's that they do it by lying and peddling racist and proto-fascist rhetoric.
You have to ban transgenderism entirely. You can't just ban it for the kids. It's got to be entirely.
Point number 7. The obsession with a plot. Thus, at the root of the fascist psychology, there is the obsession with a plot, possibly an international one. The followers must feel besieged. This is another point that, unfortunately, expresses itself quite often. Right-leaning people in America are very prone to conspiracy. Even now, there are currently a whole bunch of conspiracies in circulation. The Great Replacement Theory is one such conspiracy. It posits that there is a mission from the elites to replace white people in America with a more subservient race. The conspiracy proposes that they're doing this through mass immigration. Fear of difference, anyone? Belief in this conspiracy is born out of fear that white people will lose their majority in power. Fear of difference and cult of tradition, anyone? This is a clear conspiracy with racial supremacist roots. But how many Americans believe in it? 1/3 of Americans. Oh, but that's just one conspiracy. 1 in 5 Americans believe in QAnon conspiracy theory, which has neo-fascist and religious roots. Okay, but that's just 2 conspiracies. 20% of Americans believe 9/11 was an inside job. Okay, but Andrew Tate is popularizing the idea of the Matrix, which has millions of fervent followers and fans. Listen, most of these are being shown on national television and sometimes openly embraced by pundits on these platforms. But what about... Cultural Marxism is yet another popular conspiracy theory trying to popularize the obsession with underhanded political agendas. It also might be anti-Semitic. Americans, in particular the right, are more prone to conspiracy than anyone realizes. This also plays into the hand of anti-intellectualism, and a lot of these play into fear of difference or cult of tradition. So not only is this box checked, but it reinforces all the other boxes as well.
You have to ban transgenderism entirely. You can't just ban it for the kids. It's got to be entirely.
Point number 8. The enemy is both strong and weak. By a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. Much like point 4, this is kind of hard to explicitly show, but it is a common experience that people have. A common example of this rhetoric is that the Democrats are both the powerful elites and incompetent fools. We see this with Dementia Joe, and that he's practically brain dead, but at the same time rocketing us into radical socialism of some sort. They say that socialists, communists, anarchists, and trans people are all politically weak, yet they're the biggest threats to our society. They say the left can only play the victim and doesn't have any arguments, yet we're able to indoctrinate kids with our institutions and their arguments. They claim we're mentally ill, yet we're well enough to hide our intentions from everyone, including the government. A lot of the affirmation conspiracy theories target the Democrats as the people spearheading the actions within them. But again, it's hard to show direct evidence of this point, as it's more of an experience that people have rather than something that really goes on in a public space or even a legal space. But if you're hard-pressed to ignore this point, that's fine. The overall state of fascism will be clear by the end of the video, and it won't really change just because a couple of points are disregarded by some people.
You have to ban transgenderism entirely. You can't just ban it for the kids. It's got to be entirely.
Point number 9. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. For fascism, There is no struggle for life, but rather, life is lived for struggle.
We see call to action, quite common in fact.
Calls to rally the body of conservatives to fight and win in their culture war.
And you better be happy that we're good citizens, that we're peaceful citizens. But it's not going to be peaceful much longer, okay? And this isn't a threat. I'm not a criminal. I've never been a criminal. But I'm telling you that good citizens are going to turn into real concerned and revolutionary citizens real soon. And nobody else is going to say that. I'm probably the only person that has the balls to say what I'm saying right now. That we're building, we're organizing, and we'll work with law enforcement or without law enforcement. But you won't stop us when time comes because our families are starving. And if you don't hear the seriousness of my voice, I hope you open your ears and you absolutely listen to what I'm saying. Because this is a warning for what's coming. It's not going to be peaceful much longer. It's not going to be rah-rah. It's not going to be speeches. It's not going to be gathered outside saying a Pledge of Allegiance. It's not going to be waving flags. It's going to be real. When you've seen the things that I've seen, I went to war for this country. I've seen the ugliest, dirtiest part of humanity. I've been in combat, and I never want to go back again. But I'm telling you what, I will to save this country. If it has to be against our own citizens, it will happen. And there's a million people like me, and you won't stop us. Open the county. Let our citizens do what they need to do. Let owners of businesses do what they need to do to feed their families. Take the masks off.
You must participate unless you're letting the Democrats indoctrinate our kids. It's not a common point. In fact, it's kind of rare, but it does rear its head sometimes. But other than instances like that, there's not much here, so let's just move on. You can count this as another disregarded point.
If it has to be against our own citizens, it will happen. And there's a million people like me, and you won't stop us.
Point number 10. Contempt for the weak. Elitism is a typical aspect of any reactionary ideology.
Another day, another clothes change. Let's get to these points. This attitude permeates throughout our culture, especially with the manosphere and traditionalism. People within those spheres think that weakness and laziness are some of the worst qualities a man can possibly have, despite their definition of these terms being pretty left up in the air and completely arbitrary a lot of the time. This is particularly funny with the "weak men create hard times" quote.
Andrew Tate and the manosphere in America has popularized the idea that weak men are undesirable. They hold ultimate contempt for men who are broke, uncharismatic, or conventionally attractive. There's literally an index for sexual market value that these people will tie to your worth as a human being to. If you aren't rich, fit, and charismatic, what the fuck are you doing with your life? You're pathetic.
We even see this attitude all the time, with the common usage of both terms soy and male feminist being used as insults. Toxic masculinity, the traits that commonly hold men back from just existing as normal human beings, is propagated as a liberal lie, all while perpetrating these same traits. If you talk about your emotions, you're weak, and if you cry as a man, you're even weaker. Not only is this just extremely culturally toxic behavior and pretty bad for our society, but it also reinforces the anti-intellectualism point.
If it has to be against our own citizens, it will happen. And there's a million people like me, and you won't stop us.
Point 11. Everybody is educated to become a hero. In fascist ideology, heroism is the norm. This cult of heroism is strictly linked with the cult of death. Our schools teach us that we're the greatest country on the planet and that any soldier who has fought any war of ours is a hero by default. Our military is propagandized to be this great system, and true bravery is signing up for it. American hegemony is taught to be extremely important, and upholding that hegemony is just as crucial. We even have recruiters coming in every month or so to our schools trying to get literal children to sign up for the military. But no, it's the transes indoctrinating our children. We see the attitudes that strong and masculine men are the ones who create the good times, and that they're needed to counterbalance the weak men and the cowards. In terms of a cult or mythology of death, not really. We don't really see that. This point is not as blatant in this country as literal fascist states like Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, but it does have characteristics that do prop up in the United States. Those characteristics are especially apparent when it comes to things like JRTC, RRTC, and the Sea Cadets.
If it has to be against our own citizens, it will happen. And there's a million people like me, and you won't stop us.
Point 12. Machismo and weaponry. Machismo implies both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. Contempt for women and the idea of toxic masculinity is extremely apparent in any point of US history, including the present. The manosphere and incel culture both have particular disdain for women. They view women as possessions to acquire, another notch on their belt, rather than a human being. Incel culture is particularly egregious with this case. A lot of incels will blame women for the incels' lack of relationships.
You know what happens when women don't ever, come to terms with themselves? Bad shit happens. I don't know. Something the cops want to deny me trying to get her to be straight. Something is wrong about that. I don't see why these traditional ass motherfuckers think they can speak shit whenever it's this woke, belligerent LGBT shit that has her right now. And her father is controlling the bullshit. I just don't see it. I'm older than her fucking father. Fucking snakes, man. She was gonna lure me into a trap.
We even see this with transphobia somewhat. They'll define what a woman is around what sex parts they have, which reduces them to their sexual function and that's it, and not their qualities as people. Gay people are still marginalized, religious people are still homophobic, and the manosphere is extremely heteronormative. It's not just offshoot subcultures either. The manosphere is extremely popular with young adult men, and it only builds off of what older generations already push in terms of their views about men. It all paints a picture that could already be seen without the manosphere and incel culture, but with their inclusion, it is even clearer here. It's also worth noting that Donald Trump, the masculine manly man of masculinity and nationalism, was recently convicted of sexual assault.
Whenever it's this woke, belligerent LGBT shit that has her.
Point 13. Selective populism. There is, in our future, a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selective group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. The thing with this point is that it can usually be taken in one of two routes, that of anti-democracy or that citizens of a specific country don't have autonomy. If it is the latter, unfortunately all examples that I've found at this point are particularly niche, and I don't really feel confident in using them to prove this point to be filled. Not to mention, again, we kind of have to be under an already existing state of fascism for there to be a system that completely strips the rights of civil autonomy away from its citizens. But that's not to say we're not heading there. If it is the former, though, unfortunately for us, anti-democracy does rear its head quite often. We saw this with the January 6th attempted insurrection. We saw this with the voting age being proposed to be raised after the midterms. We saw this with Tennessee lawmakers being tossed out for basically no reason other than disagreement. We saw this with Zoe Zephyr being tossed out for basically the same reason. And even if it's not as apparent as these examples, it still does rear its head quite often.
Whenever it's this woke, belligerent LGBT shit that has her.
Point 14. Fascism speaks newspeak. All the Nazi or fascist school books made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. This one is particularly difficult to find examples for, mainly because of the way newspeak was defined here. It almost completely requires a fascist state that takes control of our education system and our entire language for it to even exist. But there are similarities with things that are already present in America. They're not exactly the same or an exact one-to-one, but they are very similar. In terms of changing or denying language, we don't see that quite often. In a malicious sense, we see that more on the right. We see it sometimes on the left, but usually it's not malicious. It's only in reference and proportional to the advent of new science. So using things like gender in a different way than we used to a billion years ago, that's only really proportional to new advents of science. But in terms of Republicans doing it, they will deny pronouns, deny words like cis, deny words like transgender, or even completely change the way we use gender and how we have been using gender for the past 40 years to fit their political needs. Also, book bans and bans on academic study are mainly done for the same reason that the usage of newspeak was done for. But other than instances like that, we do see euphemism very commonly used amongst the right. We see the effect of this with Americans being extremely two-party brained. Americans generally only think of politics within the American binary of Republicans and Democrats, never ever thinking outside of that or on a global scale. This keeps people and their opinions within a set political range that's defined by the system. This has also been largely propagated because it supports the dependence on capitalism. I mean, how could most people in America become anti-capitalist if the only two parties in the entire country that are spitting 99% of the propaganda are capitalist parties? Controlling the political sphere through the regulation of the dissemination of information and the exclusive use of the two-party system is how they keep the country and its citizens from turning revolutionary. But overall, since the newspeak portion of this point requires a state of fascism to already exist, I cannot really prove this point. It's kind of impossible to do because I would have to prove that the United States itself is an institution of fascism, which I do not have time for in any way.
Whenever it's this woke, belligerent LGBT shit that has her.
Overall, we filled 12 out of the 14 points. That's 85%. That means that the American right, at the very least, has almost 90% of the traits and qualities that a fascist state and culture has. And remember, it only takes a single point to be true for fascism to coagulate or exist in some way. We have hundreds of hate groups currently in operation in the US. We have genocidal rhetoric being pushed by popular pundits, and we have far-right conspiracies being displayed on national television. We even see the resurfacing of misogynist and toxically masculine culture through the soaring rise of Andrew Tate in the manosphere. We have proposals for a transformation into a religious state. We have legislators banning books and studies relating to marginalized people. We're seeing kids get indoctrinated into the military. We're seeing several social scapegoats that are supposedly causing the downfall of Western civilization and American hegemony. We're seeing rampant anti-intellectualism within our political space, and most notably within the conservative sphere. We've even seen anti-democracy through attempted insurrections and the proposals to change voting rights for young people so they can't vote. If none of this cries out a rise or at least pervasiveness of fascism, then you need to rethink your political consciousness entirely. Congratulations, you made it through the first section of the video. There are two more, including this one, and combined, these two will probably equal to around the same as the first section in terms of length, so strap in. We're going. This particular model focuses on the sacralization of politics through the use of totalitarianism. The original essay that this came from focused on a sort of political religion. So the model is going to be focusing on a lot of mythological aspects, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to ignore those and more focus on the political aspects rather than the mythological aspects, just to compare to the first model and see how well it fits overall when disregarding the mythological aspects that can't really be applied to America. Also, just as a final note, this probably will be going a little bit shorter. This particular section will be a lot shorter than the first one. This is going to be more of a speed round, so expect a lot of short, quick, snappy firing off of information in relation to the points. So without further ado, let's get into it. Point 1 of Emilio Gentile's essay on fascism and the sacralization of politics. A mass movement with multi-class membership in which prevail, among the leaders and the militants, the middle sectors, in large part new to the political activity, organized as a party militia that bases its identity not on social hierarchy or class origin, but on a sense of comradeship, believes itself invested with a mission of national regeneration, considers itself in a state of war against political adversaries, and aims at conquering a monopoly of political power by using terror, parliamentary politics and deals with leading groups to create a new regime that destroys parliamentary democracy. This is pretty common, this mobilization of civilians against a vague adversary and for national regression persists through organizations like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, Patriot Front, and the list goes on for like a billion years. These groups are all violent and far-right groups and militias. They were at Jan 6, they actively preach for civil war, and sometimes with even tangible violence taking place. Many Republican pundits and some voters and even some state legislators actively preach about a civil war as well. Point number 2. An anti-ideological and pragmatic ideology that proclaims itself anti-materialist, anti-individualist, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, anti-Marxist, populist, and anti-capitalist, and expresses itself aesthetically more than theoretically by means of a new political style and by myths, rites, and symbols as a lay religion designed to acculturate, socialize, and integrate the faith of the masses with the goal of creating a new man. We do not see the mythological aspects, but there are political sides to this. As far as anti-ideology, we see anti-democracy through booting congresspeople out of active hearings like we saw with the 2 Tennessee congressmen and Zoe Zephyr. We also see anti-democracy through the use of the Electoral College, but that's not important. It's also prevalent in the corporate sphere, with common union busting from the largest corporations and halting of strikes through the use of government actions. Not to mention the thing that just recently happened, where it's now possible for companies to sue strikes because of any damages that they accrue. And as for anti-Marxism, this is almost self-evident. Cultural Marxism is a scapegoat popularly used by conservatives to blame anything on when it comes to societal degeneration, and actual Marxism just breeds good-for-nothing socialists and communists who just want free stuff, etc. Now, as for anti-liberalism, this comes from the opposition to institutional welfare programs, anti-intellectual tendencies, uses of contradictory positions, both as outlined earlier, and a general aversiveness to egalitarianism, despite how much they may preach otherwise. Especially when it comes to civil liberties and civil rights, many people on the right will see civil rights as rights for me, but not for thee. This characteristic can be found in opinions of gay and trans people, and we also see this characteristic crop up in terms of medical autonomy. They disagree with free choice during pregnancy, but they would get ass mad, and they did get ass mad, over a possible vaccine mandate that would objectively save many people's lives. And no, this wasn't unique to COVID. This attitude persists throughout US history, and we even saw it during the 1918 influenza pandemic that killed hundreds of thousands of US citizens, which in today's numbers would be millions of people. They cry about medical autonomy, but they would not give two shits about the Americans who are getting their rights to life violated by the same assholes who cry about medical autonomy. And then they will legislate against abortion because then they suddenly care about their fellow man, despite most abortions taking place before the fetus is even fully formed yet, and where it is literally a clump of cells. Not just a clump of cells that looks like a human, a literal, glob of goo cells. Anywho, these people are not anti-capitalist because they adore capitalism. They love the hierarchy it provides, though they do posture as being anti-corporatism, despite most often than not being the ones doing the corporatism. And they are not anti-materialists because they associate money with willpower and strength. And they do posture as being pro-individual, but anytime civil rights get brought up, again, it's civil rights for me, but not for thee. Point number 3. A culture founded on mystical thought and the tragic and activist sense of life conceived as the manifestation of the will to power, on the myth of youth as artificer of history, and on the exaltation of the militarization of politics as the model of life and collective activity. In terms of culture being founded on mystical thought, we do see this with many traditional values being born from the Bible, and much of existing legislation being born from religious morality, despite many of them just completely disregarding the progressive values that Jesus taught. We also see this through the advocacy of a Christian nation, though thankfully this is not super popular, though again, it has been gaining traction over the years. And when it comes to the militarization of politics, We see many politically charged and far-right militia groups existing and the usage of the National Guard to quell protests, along with the odd, semi-common calls to action and violence. Conceptually, Americans hold our military in the highest regard and our military might as the utmost reason for patriotism. America number one, baby! Though with the militarization of your common life, I can only really think of that in terms of gun culture and military classes in school like ROTC, JROTC, and youth programs like the Sea Cadets. Point number 4. A totalitarian conception of the primacy of politics conceived as an integrating experience to carry out the fusion of the individual and the masses in the organic and mystical unity of the nation as an ethnic and moral community, adopting measures of discrimination and persecution against those considered to be outside this community, either as enemies of the regime or members of races considered to be inferior or otherwise dangerous for the integrity of the nation. This is evident through the Great Replacement theory and the fear-mongering surrounding it. We also see this with the conceptual Christian nation and with the persecution in cultural and legal sectors of transgender people, and with them being the number one most hated outgroup right now. Point number 5. A civil ethic founded on total dedication to the national community, on discipline, virility, comradeship, and the warrior spirit. Ultranationalism is a mainstay in the United States. America first, Christian nation, rampant American exceptionalism, glorying our status as a hyperpower and our control over the global hegemony, perpetuation of distrust against those deemed as threats to society, not to mention, all right-leaning militia groups are either nationalist or ultranationalist, even some left-leaning groups are. Most right-leaning advocacy groups are nationalist. Make America great again, etc., etc. There is literally no clearer point than maybe fear of difference on the fascism model. Point number 6. A single state party that has the task of providing for the armed defense of the regime, selecting its cadre, and organizing the masses within the state in a process of permanent mobilization of emotion and faith. We see this sometimes mostly through the use of gerrymandering. Up until recently, the Republican Party was gaining major advantages on state lines because of gerrymandering, but now with the recent Supreme Court decision and the before then discovery of the Democratic Party finally actually discovering that they have the things that they have too, we're not really going to be getting that anymore. So, awesome, thumbs up. When they lose, they just attempt to raise the voting age, just straight up, or attempt to put in a citizenship test as a prerequisite, just for the fun of it. Or they just, goof around and just do an insurrection every now and then. Just weird little stuff. And when they're feeling particularly passionate, they go out and advocate for a religious state. Or they just murder people. Though, overall, for this to be fully true, the government and the state and the whole country would already have to be fascist itself, so this is more of like a half point. Point number 7. A police apparatus that prevents, controls, and represses dissidents and opposition, including through the use of organized terror. This is commonly seen through, active police gangs, and the militarization of the police and those police gangs, and a fatal encounter with the police being an ever-increasing threat to everyone, especially with little justification on the police's part. And police unions make these literal crimes extremely hard to prosecute, and disproportionate patrolling in different zip codes also contributes to this problem. And the National Guard and police are often used to quell protest when those demonstrations have more than 3 people. Remember, the BLM riots only accounted for about 7% of the total demonstrations in 2020, yet the police and National Guard were heavily used nationwide for most of them. Not to mention, the rhetoric used by the Back the Blue movement was to paint BLM activists as violent thugs who need to be controlled or put down. So even if there was no disproportionate policing or violence or prosecution, people would support it either way. Point number 8. A political system organized by hierarchy of functions named from the top and crowned by the figure of the leader invested with a sacred charisma who commands, directs, and coordinates the activities of the party and the regime. MAGA Republicans. They worship Donald Trump to an unhealthy degree, and yeah, he is charismatic, but even in some cases we see him dictating what MAGA Republicans do and believe. We also see this hierarchy with the fervent pro-capitalism in this country. A belief in a natural economic hierarchy of some sort, and the belief that rich people deserve to be at the top, while everyone else deserves to be at the bottom. If you're not already at the top, then you might as well be a bottom. Yeah. We also see these rich people controlling politics. Elon Musk, for example, the richest man on the planet when he owned Twitter, was basically in complete and total control of the flow of political information. We even saw him exercising this control by shadow banning certain words that pertain to leftist ideas, while propping up and unbanning right-leaning accounts. People believe him to be charismatic as well, and rich people like him and Andrew Tate hold massive influence over the political sphere, with Elon's coming from his control over Twitter, up until recently, and Andrew Tate's coming from his hold over a massive portion of young men. Point number 9. Cooperative organization of the economy that suppresses trade union liberty, broadens the sphere of state intervention, and seeks to achieve, by principles of technocracy and solidarity, the collaboration of the productive sectors under the control of the regime to achieve its goals of power, yet preserving private property and class divisions. Union busting is still common, and strike busting has been done by the state. We even see companies being able to sue strikers for damages being caused during a strike, but those damages could literally be anything, so it sends a chilling effect to strikers that they probably shouldn't do that, which is an inherent form of strike busting. And I don't know if this needs to be put together for you, but the state upholding that ability is them inherently strike busting every time this happens. The goal of this is to preserve capitalism and class relations as they are. It's very fundamental to the actual inner workings of the economy and the United States itself, especially in a historical sense. Point number 10. A foreign policy inspired by the myth of national power and greatness with the goal of imperialist expansion. America First is a largely nationalistic form of domestic and foreign policy. This rhetoric is also used in relation to Ukraine, because funding Ukraine is a big drain on our military budget. Overall, as well, America First appeals to that yearning to a military greatness of the past. Most of this rhetoric seeks to proliferate American global hegemony and our status as a hyperpower. People are taught to value this status through indoctrination by our already indoctrinated parents and the way US history is taught in schools. Not to mention, the military advertises itself within our schools quite often. The reason they do this? Because they want more soldiers, so we can fight more wars, so we can gain more resources, to fuel our capitalist economy. Don't believe me? Then why is it that when American oil companies see dips in their profits, a sudden spike and increase in war making in the Middle East just suddenly happens, but then ceases the second these oil companies see returns to their profits? Crazy. Yet again, it appears that this model fits exactly onto the current political sphere of the right. Nationalism, anti-ideology, union busting, militarized hate groups that prepare for a civil war, appeals for religious authority and morality, etc. This model fits just fine. The only problem is the mythological aspect, which, as stated earlier, is not something that America even has in general. There's bits and pieces here and there, but there's no overarching mythology that you would see with Nazi Germany. Overall, discounting pure mythology, it seems this model's boxes are thoroughly checked. Now that we've covered two different models, both of which can be directly applied to the modern American political sphere, it's time to see how all of this applies to some definitions. We're going to look at two different definitions, Merriam Webster and the Wikipedia definition, one of high credibility and one of medium credibility respectively. This definition demonstrates at least one characteristic on the right that applies to every single point here. Ultranationalism is seen everywhere on the right, And radical supremacy is often seen implicitly, though sometimes explicitly. They view each person as a member of the nation, but no more valuable than the nation itself. And in terms of MAGA Republicans, they practically worship Donald Trump, and they want him as a president, or just a leader in general, even to undemocratic proportions as seen with January 6. So we do see that they are willing to try and forcibly put someone into office. They want to uphold class divisions and would most likely do away with many welfare programs, which would only uphold and exacerbate existing class divisions. Though I don't think they would try to implement any centralization. I think their approach would be more along the lines of Nazi Germany, where they keep the private sector intact, they just have most companies being contracted by the government. And a lot of Republicans want to get rid of transitioning entirely, which is literally, by definition, suppressing societal opposition. And in terms of political opposition, the media and the press are both seen as like enemies of the people, and untrustworthy, and entirely partisan. And while that isn't forcible opposition yet, that is coercive opposition through indoctrination. Because when you're in a cult, if your cult leaders or the people you like the most are telling you not to listen to the opposition, that might as well be the same thing. But the reasons why they don't forcibly suppress opposition is because of one of three things, or all of them. Either they want to ride off the coattails of free speech, they don't have the political power to do so, or because they're just infantile and indoctrination is just as effective as if you were to just forcibly suppress it anyways. Far right? Check. Authoritarian? Check. Alright. Police gangs, militarization of the police, use of the National Guard, general anti-democracy, book bans, they want to ban social media apps under the guise of national security, they want to raise the voting age, etc. That all sounds pretty authoritarian to me. Ultranationalist? Check. It's pretty fucking obvious. Characterized by a dictatorial leader? No, thankfully, but they do have someone that they've already tried forcibly putting into office over somebody who was democratically elected and who would likely stay there for a long time. Not to mention a lot of these people spew rhetoric of doing another Jan 6. But to be fair to the dictatorial point, if Trump was forcibly instated, then he would by default have more power than any elected official, even including any president. But why is that the case? Well, because he wouldn't be able to be impeached because he wasn't instated fairly or democratically in the first place. Election cycles and terms wouldn't mean much because he was reinstated outside of the electoral cycle and undemocratically, so he would be able to be there forever, and he would have complete control over the Supreme Court, which would give him total control over the judicial branch and the executive branch. And since he wouldn't be able to be impeached, the only way to remove him from office would be a counter-insurrection, basically making him a proto-dictator. Centralized autocratic militarism? Not really. I don't really see much of that, so awesome. Forcible suppression of opposition? I already talked about this. Belief in a natural social hierarchy? Yes. They believe your economic status is exactly what you deserve, and if you don't have your preferred economic status, then that's just you're lazy and you don't work hard enough, and that's just how the world is, despite any opposing evidence. A clear example of this is their disdain for welfare because of handouts, but will subsidize billionaire companies even though they're demonstrably failing, and they will clap for billionaires despite them not working not nearly as hard as any random blue-collar worker, and the reason they even have all that money in the first place is because of either subsidies, exploitation, or old/inherited money. Subordination of individual interests for the perceived good of the nation and race? Unless we're talking about gay people or gay conservatives who get told to just not be gay to simply uphold the status quo and keep the population numbers up and stuff like that, then I don't really think so, but that kind of rhetoric does exist. Strong regimentation of society and the economy? Kinda. Well, they actively support class divisions, as stated earlier, and that only really plays into corporatism, or at least in favor of corporatism, but that's not really seen from the government, more from the right itself, though corporatism obviously has a handle over the government. but the class divisions and upholding of class divisions and the support of corporatism is only really seen from the right. In synopsis, it's clear that many fascist traits can be applied to the American right and America itself. While we don't see as much of these traits in the legislative sector, it still exists, it's still there, it still rears its head, and it's not pretty when it does. The majority of fascism is coming from the American right as a form of political culture. They want to take people's rights away, they appeal to conspiracy, they're undemocratic, they're anti-intellectual, they call for extermination sometimes, they are part of literal hate groups sometimes, they're ultra-nationalist, and in some cases straight up racist. There's a growing culture of fatal transphobia. There are calls for their extermination, there are calls for removing their medical autonomy, there are calls for suppressing their civil rights. They're even suppressing the dissemination of information that would lead to people having different views through book bans and academic bans. They often use anti-criticism rhetoric, such as anti-press rhetoric, anti-academic rhetoric, such as being against liberal arts, calling it bad, stupid, gay, whatever, a useless degree, whatever. Just any way that they can keep people from criticizing the status quo. They blame conspiracies such as cultural Marxism, and they blame ideologies and worldviews such as postmodernism as the central points to the downfall of Western society. They also view American global hegemony as good and necessary, while also letting our military inside of our schools to indoctrinate our kids, along with all the American exceptionalism that we're taught by in schools. There's also a growing resurgence of misogynistic culture and a disdain for men who are poor, uncharismatic, weak, etc., through the use and rise of Andrew Tate and the manosphere. They appeal to and largely believe in conspiracy and go so far, sometimes, as to display them and favor them on national television. And most of these conspiracies are anti-Semitic, just genuinely straight up racist, white supremacist, anti-democratic, or American exceptionalist. And these are things that you can find in mere minutes by just Googling around about specific topics. And this video didn't even go into a lot of topics. Like, we left a lot of stuff out, like the intentional deconstruction of class consciousness, the upholding of capitalism and corporatism, race relations just in general, class relations, the CIA and FBI meddling in literally fucking everything, including international affairs, TikTok bans largely, the culture war as a purposeful distraction from larger issues, etc. Those and so many other topics would only serve to reinforce this video and make it even stronger rhetorically, despite the loads of examples that we already have. Both of the model's points were overwhelmingly met, the definitions were met, and even just from a common sense standard, they are also met. It's clear to see and really easy to state and argue that the American right has a very big fascism problem. Aggregated governments like states, less so, and the federal government, all even less so, but all of them still display fascist tendencies, or at the very least, authoritarian tendencies. And yes, being a part of and participating in the culture war on the side of conservatives, even as a moderate, contributes to these fascist tendencies. And yes, being a moderate in the electoral sector also contributes to these tendencies. And yes, questioning the validity of people like trans people, even if you aren't unsupportive or hate them, still emboldens people who do and have a larger voice than you. Even if you're not on their side, functionally and pragmatically, you are. Giving equal credence to marginalized groups and the people that want them dead is actively contributing to fascism. We don't defeat fascism through the marketplace of ideas. We never have. That's never how it's been worked. The marketplace of ideas is ineffective for dispelling misinformation. It only serves to embolden it. This is evident from the mere fact that fascism still pervades through our culture in a large sense. We fight fascism by wholesale rejecting everything even closely resembling to it. Stop voting for people who platform or hang with fascists. Stop voting for people who will give more power over the government to corporations through lobbying. Stop voting for people who actively try to restrict academia and education, and stop giving equal credence to people who want marginalized groups dead simply because they don't fit the mold.
All you really have to do is just support marginalized individuals, stand against authoritarianism, including state enforcers like the police, and stand with your fellow citizens and not the status quo. But remember, it only takes a single fucking point to be true for fascism to persist. Organize. Be an anti-fascist.